So my name is Carl, and my wife Christine. As Pastor Craig said, we are missionaries to Rowan University. And a lot of times when we tell people we're missionaries to Rowan University and we're missionaries to a college, they ask us where we're going next. And I'm like, no, we're missionaries right there. And as Pastor Craig said, we believe that the university is one of the most strategic mission fields in the world. And it's a place where future culture is shaped now. Because believe it or not, those 18-year-olds sitting in classrooms are one day going to rule the world. That's scary. Just kidding. But so the things that they are learning now and the encounters that they have that push them towards or away from God, we can be there in that moment to reach them. And so my wife and I, we have 4 kids. There's a picture up there. That's the 4 of us. That's as good as you get, at least that we've been able to get with 4 kids. But so we have kids that we love dearly. They bring so much joy as well as so much angst to our life, sometimes at the same time. Anybody with kids can... And as missionaries, we have prayer cards. Now, I remember I grew up in an AG church very much like this. And I remember missionaries coming in and they'd bring their prayer cards and they'd say, take one of these. And I would just look at them and be like, okay, that's cool. I'll take that home and I'm not going to throw it away, but I'll just lose it. I don't know if any of you have ever done that. Don't judge me. But when we say, please take this and pray, man, we so covet your prayers. We would love your prayers. My running joke, I'm even getting bored of hearing it over and over again, but there's only 3 kids on this picture, but there's 4 kids on that picture. And so we need new prayer cards. And all you need to do is take one, and then I can justify getting more. So for the sake of Callum, our 2-year-old, take a prayer card, and so we can get new ones. All right, so I'm here this morning to share with you about entering through the door of dismay. And so, as a missionary and a guest speaker, Pastor Craig was kind enough to hand me this very gentle and soft topic of the door of dismay. So when you think about me and Chi Alpha, my wife, and Rowan University, you're going to think such happy thoughts of doors of dismay. So here we are. I'm actually really excited about the word that I feel like the Lord has put on my heart. And so all of us enter through different circumstances in life. Sometimes those are great circumstances, and we have these spiritual highs. We have these emotional highs, whether it's a promotion or you meet someone and you fall in love, or you have a kid and it's this beautiful moment. We have these moments in our lives that just, man, they bring such life and joy. But then we also have these moments where challenges come and things aren't going our way, and our emotions, everything about us, sometimes our spiritual connection with God is even challenged in those circumstances. And it's just part of being human. When things are good, we feel good, and when things are bad and we go through that door of dismay, it becomes a challenge. And I think no one articulates these emotional swings better than a toddler. I don't know how many of you have ever experienced the life of a toddler and watching it, but when things are going good, they get a piece of candy or they get ice cream, or someone that they love walks in their door, they know they're going to get to play, they're excited. But who knows the wrath of a toddler? On Tuesday, I was sitting in my office and my wife was taking our 2-year-old son and trying to get him changed so they could go to the park. Now, he didn't know what was coming, but he was about to go have fun at the park. But all of a sudden, I hear this screaming, and it's the screaming of the wrath of a toddler, if you know what I'm talking about. And so I find out what the wrath and the screaming is about. Now, it was a 75-degree day. And my wife was trying to stop my 2-year-old from wearing sweatpants, jeans, and pajama bottoms to the park to play. It's a good outfit to go play in the snow, but not so much on a 75-degree day. And so for a long time, he just screamed. because he entered through the door of dismay of my wife not allowing him to wear what he wanted to wear. I shared this story in first service when my wife was downstairs with our children. Now I'm afraid to share it because I don't want her to have to live through the trauma a second time. But we can see in a toddler that emotional just change that happens based on circumstances. But how many know that as adults, or if you're a teenager in this place, we should have a little bit more maturity in what happens, but maybe internally we still feel it. On the outside, we can put on a good face when things aren't going good, but on the inside, there's that dismay that is happening. That feeling of things not going the way that you anticipated or that you thought it was going to go. But as adults, and more importantly, as followers of Christ, when we enter through that door of dismay, we have the opportunity to choose what we do. And I think that this particular door opens up to two paths. When you enter into the door of dismay, regardless of what the circumstance might be, because how many people know my door of dismay might look different than yours? The circumstances can be very different. One could be the loss of a job or of a dream, and the other one can be loss of a family member. But each door to you can feel the same weight of dismay. Does that make sense? But I think when we get there, we have two paths that the door opens to. One path will bring us down and pull us further away from the Lord and his presence. But the other path that we can choose to take will bring us to closer intimacy with the Lord, closer revelation of who God is, and a closer walk with him. And so we get to choose how we respond when we enter through the door of dismay. I believe that it's our choice, and we're going to look through the Word of God, and we're going to look through Job and see how we get to choose the way that we walk and the way that we respond. And the second thing I want us to learn today, or to look at, is what can we learn from this experience? As you go through and you make the choice of which path I'm going to take, then you get to see what you can learn as you walk through this door of dismay. Now, if anyone can relate to a door of dismay, it could be Job. Man, Job's door of dismay, as we're about to read, is so epic that it makes anything that I've ever walked through seem like a walk in the park. But as I said a moment ago, just because someone's door of dismay seems bigger than yours doesn't mean it doesn't rock the foundation of your life as much. And so although none of us have probably experienced quite what Job has, the door of dismay that we walk through still can rock the foundation of our lives, and we can still learn from it. So quickly, we're going to read through and find out a little bit about this man. Job 1, it says this: there is this man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and this man was blameless. He was upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys. I don't know if anyone's been to Pastor Craig's house recently, but he is trying to become the new Job. He's got some goats out there, some chickens, a baby lamb. My kids and I were over there last night, and they were like in awe, loving it. You got a little way to go, though, before you catch up with Job. But there, continues on, he says he has very many servants. And then it says, so that this man was the greatest of all people of the East. That is a big title. And then it continues on, and it talks about how his children would basically throw parties. And that after they did these parties, Job would go and he would make sacrifices and offerings unto the Lord just in case they sinned. I mean, Job was awesome. quick highlights again. He was blameless and upright. And he feared God and turned away from evil. How many people, man, I would love if God would say that about me. He had 10 children and he was extremely wealthy. I looked it up on Google, and you know you can never fully trust everything you read on Google. But I found a couple different spots where different people tried to estimate how much his wealth was just based on the livestock that was mentioned here. Who knows what else he had? But that ranged, and it's a pretty big range, between $5 million and $50 million. This was a wealthy, wealthy man. And like I said, to top it all off, he was the greatest of all the people of the East. That is an amazing title. But then, like I said, to take it a step further, to show his heart before God, not knowing what his kids did, anytime they had one of these parties, he would go and make a sacrifice the next morning on their behalf in case they sinned. He was upright before God. And then as we read in verse 7, I'm going to summarize it. Satan comes and he speaks and has this conversation with the Lord. And in verse 8 it says, the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him on all of the earth, blameless and upright, who fears God and turns away from evil. And then Satan answered the Lord and says, does Job fear you for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all he has? On every side you have blessed the works of his hand, and his possessions have increased. And then he challenges God and says, but stretch your hand and touch all he has, and he will curse you to your face. And so here Satan points out, and he says the only reason that he loves you and that he respects you and that he fears you is just because he's got so much good stuff. But God, understanding and knowing his character, he says to him that he can go and that Satan can take things away from him. And so it says in verse 7 of chapter 2, so Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job. Oh, sorry, I skipped ahead. In verse 20 of chapter 1, then Job arose and tore his robe, because what happened was God allowed Satan, and Satan in one foul swoop took away all of his wealth and his possessions. He took away his children. And so you can imagine this man, the greatest in the East, with all of these children that he loved, all of this wealth taken away. But this was his response afterwards. Then Job arose and he tore his robes, he shaved his head, he fell on the ground and worshiped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And in all this, Job did nothing, no sin, nor charged God with any wrong. In the midst of losing all of this, his family, his children, his wealth, it says that he did not sin. He did not charge God with any of this. He didn't blame God. But then Satan comes to him and says, hey, if you strike him, if you take upon, his physical body and allow him to become sick, then he will curse you. And so Satan was allowed to do this. And this man who was already broken, this man who had already lost so much, it says that we find him sitting in the ground with ashes poured over him, scraping himself with pottery on these sores that Satan had inflicted him with. And you just think about how much his circumstances changed. The greatest in the East, with this full family, this massive wealth that I'm guessing none of us in this room have ever experienced and ever will. Now sitting on the floor, covered in ashes, covered in sores, scraping himself with broken pottery. And the contrast of his life being at this great high point to this great low point. It is incredible. And then to top it all off, his wife says to him in chapter 2, verse 9, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one a foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" And in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Here he was with so much taken away from him. But he chose in this moment to remain steadfast and to remain strong. And I believe he was here, standing with the door open, looking at the two paths that he could go down. And he said, "I'm going to choose this path of worshiping the Lord." But as time goes on, sometimes there are different pitfalls that can come our way. And I think as we go through the door of dismay, we can go back and forth between these two paths. We get to make that choice. And I think the first pitfall that comes to us is thinking that all of your circumstances are based on your actions, where you can start thinking that this must have been my fault. Now, if you are a student and you fail a test because you didn't study, it's probably your fault. If you're speeding and you get a speeding ticket, I'm going to go ahead and say it's your fault. If you rob a bank and you get put in jail, your circumstances made that happen. But sometimes if a family member gets cancer, or you lose your job because the company goes out of business, or COVID happens, and who knows how many stories are here about how we were affected by COVID. We can start to think that this must be because of something that we did. Job's friends, they come in. He has 3 friends that come to him. And it says that they sat with him, and for 7 days they sat in silence with him. Man, those are some good friends in that moment. How many know when you go through something as tragic as what he went through, having some people sit with you and just be with you, that ministers something to your soul. But then something changed. Then they opened their mouths. How many people know sometimes you're a much better friend before you open your mouth? And then they start saying to him, "There must have been some sin that you committed. What did you do? Confess it before God, and maybe he will take this all away from you." And for chapters upon chapters, Job's friends say, "What did you do?" Each one in a different way. But he stays steadfast in knowing that it wasn't his sin. He said, "I've been faultless before God." But sometimes for us, when circumstances come our way, I don't know about you, but you could start questioning, did I do something to bring this upon myself? And when you go through the door of dismay, again, if you get a speeding ticket, don't do that again, and that's the problem. But for a lot of other reasons, a lot of other doors that we enter through, we need to be careful not to say, God is doing this to me because I have sinned against him. But then, as his circumstances stayed the same, eventually he got a little bit more worn down. I mean, sometimes you can stand strong at first, but eventually, as you're in that door of dismay for longer periods of time, you get tired. And it's harder to stay so strong. And in chapter 7, verse 17, we see a little bit of that heart being pulled and worn down. Job says this, "What is man that you make so much of him, that you set your heart on him, visit him on every morning and test him every moment? How long will you look away from me? Or nor leave me alone till I swallow my spit. If I sin, what did I do to you, you watcher of mankind? Why have you made me your mark? Why have I become a burden to you? And the second pitfall that I think we can fall into is starting to blame God for your circumstance or questioning his character. See, now he got to the point. He had said, hey, I know I am faultless. I haven't sinned before God. So what is it that you're doing to me, God? And he started questioning the character and the motives of God. In one commentary, it says this: in asking this question, Job really asked why God bothered with him. He felt as though God were a cat and he were a mouse. Surely God had better things to do than pick on him. And so he felt like God was just messing with him. He went from this blameless man before God who feared him to questioning God. What are you doing? Are you just playing with me like some little mouse? And sometimes I think when we walk through this door of dismay, we can get to this point where we question the character and the goodness of God. How could you allow this? Are you really in control? I thought you were better than this, God. How have you brought me to this point? And we start questioning who God is. Now let me say something. It's human. You read the Psalms, and David has some emotional moments with God. I heard another minister recently said one day he was pouring his heart out to God, and he realized something, that God can handle it. And so there's a difference, I think, between saying, God, what's going on, and questioning his character. And it is a fine line. So I want to say it's okay in those moments to say, God, what is happening? But it's another thing to question his character and his goodness. It's a dangerous place to be. Now, I want to share a little bit about our story. And again, compared to what we have just read, this seems so small. But the journey that I have gone through emotionally, spiritually, in the last season with Chi Alpha, I think many of us can relate to in different ways. So some history of Chi Alpha. My wife and I, we met in Chi Alpha in the early 2000s. We were both students at Rowan. We led worship together. And eventually, despite all of her efforts to not like me, we fell in love. And so we got married shortly after graduating. And then 10 years ago, we got back involved in Chi Alpha after a season of not being involved. I was working full-time at my church, doing Chi Alpha as well. And man, I started to really love Chi Alpha. The ministry was growing. And it was growing. And it came to this point where my wife and I had a lot of conversations. And we were like, I think this needs to be what we do full time. So 5 years ago, we became missionaries through the Assemblies of God to Rowan University. And so we have been there with a heart to disciple students, to lead students to Christ. And we've ranged between 80 and 100 plus students part of this ministry. Coming every week on Thursdays, being part of small groups. God has done great things. But then we came to this point where we knew God had so much more. You know, we had mostly Christian students coming in, which was great. Their lives were transformed. They became stronger disciples of Christ. But I knew that we needed to reach the campus more. We had students come and give their lives to Christ, but I knew that we needed to see more students come to know Christ. And so we started praying and continuing just to see how we could do it different, fasting and strategizing, being trained. And over the years, God has shaped and molded Chi Alpha to be different. And in 2019, this was last year, things were moving. This is a picture of our fall retreat. It was this powerful time where God moved. He strengthened people's relationships with each other and with him. We had this powerful time with about 15 or more students praying to receive the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And it was one of those like tangible moments where it's like, there's this one kid in our ministry. He is like the most reserved kid ever. And he was just like shaking in the power of God. Like he had never seen this growing up. It wasn't his church background. He wasn't mimicking somebody. And he's praying in tongues. And I was like, I never thought I would see that happen. God was just moving. It was a powerful time. We started going through and we were doing more and more evangelism. And one of my favorite things that I was doing in spring of 2020 was going out and walking up to students that didn't know Christ with a freshman. And taking this freshman that grew up in the church, had never shared their faith, and having them watch me engage an atheist or an agnostic in a like very pleasant, just wonderful conversation, not confrontational. And I remember one moment where the student Darian walked away and she's like, that was incredible. I've never done that before. I've never sat with an atheist and just talked about who God is. And I could feel the change happening within Chi Alpha. And I'm like, man, if these freshmen can start off sharing their faith so boldly, imagine what they can do by the time they're seniors. Then we got a CMIT program, which is a campus minister in training. It's a nationally recognized internship program. We have a picture of a couple of our students at an axe throwing place. So that's me, and then Mark right there. He runs our internship. He's been part of Chi Alpha for years. He's an incredible guy, and his wife's over there. And then Joelle's in the middle. She is one of our first interns, and then Amy over there. And we were just excited. We're like, man, God's doing something. We're going to have interns. When they graduate, they can apply for credentials with the Assemblies of God. And I'm like, man, things are just revving up. And I was in awe of what was happening. And then how many people here are familiar with the middle of March of 2020? And all of a sudden, COVID hit. I went from being on campus, sharing the gospel multiple times in a week on campus with students, thinking this is the new Chi Alpha. Things are different than they've ever been, to having Zoom meetings with less than half of our group showing up. No access to students on campus. I'm not talking to anybody about the gospel. They're not there. And all of a sudden, the foundation was rocked. All of a sudden, all the things that I felt like God was doing and moving and growing and changing felt like it was taken out from under me. And so I went through and I prayed and went to some trainings on Zoom, because that's what you did in the summer of 2020. Regrouped, and I was excited for September. I was like, you know what? We're going to do it different. We're going to make this work, and we're going to have 4 different Chi Alpha meetings at the same time, so they're smaller and more COVID-friendly. And we're going to record messages, and we're going to have live worship with just simple acoustic guitar, and then they're going to watch the video, and they're going to be in families, and they're going to love each other more intimately because I'm going to tell them to, and it's just going to be great. And we were excited. And I thought to myself, people are going to be so desperate for relationships, they're going to be running to Chi Alpha. So then I get to September. Can't find 4 places for our different groups to meet. Place that we used to meet, we couldn't. Rowan wouldn't let any club have rooms anymore. So I'm scrambling around like for a month trying to figure it out. It's the week before our first meeting, and we finally find 4 locations. I'm up on Wednesday, the night before our meeting. I'm up to 2 a.m. preaching and gathering the files on a video camera to send over to our student to put together. I'm a night person, but preaching at 1 a.m. to a video camera in an empty room, it's not quite what I thought I had signed up for. And so September comes and things are just dragging. Our group is half the size of what it was. I'm working harder than I've ever worked before, and it feels like I'm getting nowhere. Such a little amount of connection with our students because I can't be with them. In the middle of October hits, and I am just burnt out. Emotionally drained, physically drained, spiritually drained. Meanwhile, my wife is doing Zoom or WebEx calls with all of the kids' teachers, making sure a 5-year-old can do kindergarten on WebEx. So my wife is just drained too. In the middle of October, man, it was a sad, sad moment in my life. And I began wondering, what was God allowing to happen? Why were we here? And I think the third pitfall that we can get into is allowing our hearts to turn bitter towards God. There's one thing to question God, but then our hearts can become bitter. And Job experienced this. It says in chapter 10, he said, I loathe my very life. Therefore, I will give free rein to my complaint and speak out in the bitterness of my soul. Let's face it, when we get to these hard places, sometimes our hearts just turn bitter. You don't mean for it to happen. You don't want it to happen, but you just start turning bitter. And I could feel that happening in my heart. I was like, God, I feel like you took something away from me. And if we're not careful, as we walk down that path that I said, we have two choices. If we walk down the path full of pitfalls, we can find ourselves getting bitter towards God unless we get to the place where we have an encounter with Him. And in chapter 38, things change. After all this back and forth between Job and his friends, God finally speaks, and He says this in chapter 38. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you understand. Whew. How many people want God to say that to them? Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Man, God's not holding punches with the way that He's speaking right here. Who stretched a measure line across it? On what were its footings set, or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. And I can only imagine after all of the things that he thought and had said to God at this point, the bitterness that had begun to be in his heart. When God spoke this to him, man, it put him in his place, I bet, real fast. And so after 2 chapters of God speaking to him like this, he finally responds back to the Lord. In chapter 40, verse 4, it says this, I'm unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. For 2 more chapters, God just again says these things to him and puts Job in his place. And then finally, he responds to the Lord in chapter 42. It says, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is it that can obscure my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now, I will speak. I will question you, and you shall answer me. My ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen. And in these doors of dismay, there's something that can change from just our ears hearing to our eyes seeing God in a new way. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in the dust and ashes. And here he was in this place, repentant and humbled before God for the thoughts that he had had, for the questions that he had had. God, how could I have questioned you, your goodness, your wisdom, your knowledge, or your plans? And as I said, when we enter the door of dismay, there's two paths that we can choose, and sometimes we jump back and forth, but it's where you finish that matters. We can go down the path of pitfalls, or we can go down the path that leads us closer to him. And there's three quick things I want to share that I think that Job found out firsthand. And the first is a greater understanding of the power and might of God. Man, you walk through the door of dismay. Life can be so challenging, but then life can be put in perspective where we get a better understanding of the power and the might of God. And sometimes it's because things change. Like our brother shared this morning, his testimony of being in ICU and then being healed. Sometimes it doesn't end that way though. But even in the midst of that, we can have a better understanding of the power and the might of God when we allow our perspective to be changed. The next thing is a clearer revelation of God's wisdom that goes beyond ours. We need to get to a place that we understand, and sometimes we need to go down the door of dismay to get us there, where we understand a clearer revelation that God's wisdom is so far beyond ours, that he knows what the future holds, that he knows how it will end. And his desire is for our hearts to be molded and shaped to become more like him. See, God has eternity on mind, where sometimes we only have this earth in mind. And it's not that God doesn't care about what happens on this earth to us. He does. But he's so much more concerned with the big picture and with eternity. And the third thing that I believe we can learn is to have a humble and repentant and submitted heart before God. When we get to that place where we say, God, I'm humbled in front of you. I know my place in this world now. A repentant heart, if we have gotten to the place of questioning him or having bitterness. And a submitted heart that says, God, your will be done regardless. Mold me and shape me. Sometimes, my wife says this to our little kids all the time, we don't get to change our circumstances, but we can change how we respond. And we need to be people that even in the midst of the hardest doors of dismay, we allow ourselves to be submitted before God. And I'm going to close by bringing this together. I was on a walk in the middle of October, praying to God. Like I said, I was emotionally, physically, spiritually, I was just spent. And I was on this walk saying, God, what are we doing? What is happening? I was grumbling a little bit. And then finally something broke in my heart. And I just started repeating these words, Jesus, you are Lord. Jesus, you are Lord. Chi Alpha is not mine, it is yours. My reputation isn't tied to Chi Alpha because that was part of my problem. My self-worth is not tied to what's happening in Chi Alpha because that was part of my problem. But Lord, it is yours and I am yours. Jesus is Lord. And I just over and over again, I started to confess, Jesus, you are Lord. And I humbled myself and I repented before God. And I said, God, I trust you that you know what is happening and you know the plans for this ministry. It is not my vision that matters, it's yours. And I had this encounter with God that rocked me. And the next few weeks, oh my goodness, everything changed. Nothing circumstantial changed. All the situations were still the same, but my heart was different. COVID was still there. The restrictions were still there. Our numbers didn't double overnight. But my heart was changed. And I entered this place where I realized that everything that we were going through in my life, and all of you guys, but I could only speak for myself, the things that I was learning in that moment about who God was, his character, are going to shape and mold me for the rest of my life if I would continue to allow them. And the things that I've learned and the things that we've changed in Chi Alpha just this semester, I believe next year we will be stronger for it, and we will see more people come to know Christ because of it. And so in a weird way, I'm thankful for walking through this door of dismay. 2 really quick testimonies. This week I was talking to a student, his name was Kevin. He'd been to Chi Alpha 3 times the last 3 weeks. And I asked him, I was like, hey Kevin, how'd you find us? And he's like, well, I'm an atheist. I was like, not expecting to hear him say that because no one invited him. He just showed up. He's like, I was just looking for people. And he had heard 3 messages, been part of 3 services, and I could see on his face the intensity of the wheels turning. And he just looked at me. He said, do you really believe all of this? I was like, I do. And he's like, if I wanted to read the Bible, where would I start? And I was like, why don't we start in John? And I got his phone number, and I'm hoping to meet with him this week. But in the middle of nowhere, in the midst of COVID, God has brought numerous new people in. One of our interns, the one that I showed that picture of, Amy, this year she's graduating the program and she's going to Arab world next year. I can't say where, but she's going overseas to work with AGWM, the Assemblies of God World Missionaries, to minister to Muslims. She was a college student who came as a freshman. She went through Chi Alpha. Now she's the first of what I pray is many missionaries leaving Rowan University. And so I could see that God is doing so much, but my heart was the thing that needed to change the most, not my circumstances. And so wherever you are, I want to just lay this down one more time. You get to choose when you open the door of dismay which path you go down. You don't get to choose if you go down the door of dismay. Sometimes circumstances open it up and they just shove you through. But you get to pick, do you go to the right or do you go to the left?